Welcome to the debate. This week, we've seen, honestly, one of the most alarming events in the history of Bitcoin self-custody. Between $38 and $70 million of Bitcoin just, poof, vanished.
Yeah, completely swept away from dormant accounts.
Exactly. Stolen by automated scripts before users even knew they were under attack. And when we talk about building a fortress to protect something as valuable as a digital master key, we obsess over the walls, right? We demand reinforced concrete, thick steel vault doors, tamper-evident seals.
The whole 9 yards.
Right. But what happens if the manufacturer of the combination lock inside that beautiful thick steel door accidentally designs it so that, under certain conditions, the lock silently ignores your complex combination, and instead it just resets itself to a sequence as simple as 1, 2, 3, 4?
Right. The walls are still thick, the steel is heavy, but the actual mathematical security has just evaporated from the inside out, which is exactly the nightmare scenario the cryptocurrency community is waking up to right now.
It is. We are looking at the July 30th and 31st, 2026 disclosures regarding a catastrophic vulnerability in the random number generator, the RNG of the commercial hardware wallet, Coldcard, produced by CoinKite.
And the scope of this is just staggering.
It really is. For devices running the MK3 firmware, specifically 4.01 and later, as well as the newer MK4, MK5, and the Q models, the firmware suffered a silent failure. Instead of properly pulling true randomness from a dedicated hardware chip to generate a user's master key, the software fell back on a predictable periodic down counter.
Which means, and just to make sure people are picturing this correctly, it wasn't generating a random number at all.
No.
It was functionally using a countdown timer that simply combined the device's serial number and its internal clock.
Precisely. So it reduced the entropy, the mathematical unpredictability of those user seeds from an unbreakable 128 or 256 bits down to a highly vulnerable 40 to 72 bits.
Wow.
Yeah. And the real-world consequences that automated sweep bots scanning the blockchain for mathematically weak keys managed to drain somewhere between 594 to over 1,000 Bitcoin from single signature addresses.
I mean, if you're listening to this and you've got a Coldcard sitting in your desk drawer, you're probably sweating right now, right? You're wondering exactly how you set it up 3 years ago. It's just a profound failure of trust.
It really is. Which brings us to our central question today. In light of this profound software failure inside a highly secure hardware device, does the dedicated, physical hardware vault philosophy represented by Coldcard still offer the best security for self-custody? Or is the stateless, DIY zero-trust philosophy, championed by the open-source project SeedSigner, the necessary path forward?
Right.
I maintain that despite severe software implementation flaws, dedicated hardware with physical tamper resistance remains absolutely essential for robust security, provided it is properly managed by the user.
And I look at this exact disaster and see proof that persistent memory and corporate centralization are fundamental, unpatchable architectural vulnerabilities. I'll be making the case that the stateless, zero-trust approach of SeedSigner is really the only mathematically sound model for preserving digital sovereignty moving forward.
Well, let me lay out why I stand by the hardware vault model, and specifically Coldcard's foundational philosophy here. Coldcard is designed, from the circuit board up, to be an out-of-the-box physical fortress.
Physically, yes.
Right. It utilizes dual secure elements, specifically the microchip ATCC608 and the Maxim DS28C36, to mathematically bind and protect your secrets. It arrives in tamper-evident packaging. The critical chips on the board are covered in hardened epoxy.
Sure.
The entire design philosophy is that if an adversary breaks into your house and physically steals the device off your desk while it's powered off, they cannot extract your private key, even if they have millions of dollars of specialized laboratory equipment.
And I don't dispute the physical hardening. They did a good job there.
Right. Now, the recent RNG software fallback is undeniably a severe operational failure. But the foundational premise of protecting keys from physical extraction, that remains structurally sound. The silicon hardware, the vault itself, did not fail. A firmware abstraction layer failed.
But that's a massive failure.
It is, but this is the crucial part. Users who followed operational best practices during setup were completely protected. Specifically, if a user generated their seed by adding at least 50 independent manual dice rolls during the initial setup, their funds are perfectly safe today.
That assumes a lot of user expertise, though.
It assumes taking responsibility. The vault model works beautifully if you take the responsibility to properly secure the lock yourself.
Look, that's a fair point about the manual override, but you're somewhat throwing the baby out with the bathwater here by defending the very black box that failed in the first place. I come at it from a different way.
Go on.
This catastrophic RNG flaw perfectly illustrates the inherent unavoidable danger of relying on specialized hardware components and complex proprietary firmware. When you trust a corporate device to generate your foundational secret, you are trusting layers of opaque C code that you, the user, cannot independently verify.
Which SeedSigner avoids? How exactly?
By flipping the dangerous paradigm entirely. SeedSigner is built on a generic Raspberry Pi Zero. It uses an off-the-shelf camera and an off-the-shelf display.
Right, hobbyist parts.
Exactly. But the defining feature is that it completely eliminates persistent memory because it stores zero data in flash memory. The simple act of turning the power off completely wipes the keys from existence. It enforces a stateless defense.
But you still have to generate a key.
Yes, but you generate the entropy physically yourself, and you process it through a 100% free and open source MIT licensed codebase. It is minimal enough for independent auditors to inspect every single line. It circumvents hidden firmware flaws and, as we'll discuss later, the physical supply chain tracking associated with centralized corporate vendors.
Let's dive deep into the mechanics of this July 2026 RNG failure, because understanding exactly how it broke is vital to understanding the differing philosophies here. When a user asks a hardware wallet to create a new wallet, they expect the true random number generator, the TRNG, to sample chaotic physical phenomena.
Right.
We're talking about measuring literal thermal noise in the silicon to create 256 bits of pure randomness.
Yeah, and just to contextualize that for the audience, 256 bits of entropy offers more possible combinations than there are atoms in the observable universe. It is mathematically impenetrable.
Exactly. Unbreakable. But a bug in the firmware meant that if the software, for whatever technical reason, failed to read that TRNG properly, it silently decided to use a backup pseudo-random number generator.
And that PRNG was tragically simple.
Tragically.
Let's unpack what a down counter actually means in this context. It essentially tied the generation of the master key to the device's serial number and its internal clock. So wait, let me make sure I'm framing this clearly for the listener. If an attacker knows roughly when a device was manufactured and what sequential serial numbers Coldcard was shipping at that time, they have drastically narrowed the universe of possibilities, right?
Yes, it essentially collapses the universe of atoms down to a sandbox.
Exactly. A 40 to 72-bit key space isn't just slightly weaker. It can be brute forced by modern computing clusters in days, if not hours. This is why SeedSigner's model inherently neutralizes this threat. SeedSigner forces the user to rely on physical entropy from the start. You roll physical casino dice, or you use the generic digital camera sensor to capture environmental optical noise.
Right. Image noise.
Yeah. You aren't hoping a complex line of code correctly interfaces with a tiny piece of specialized silicon. You are the mathematical source of the entropy.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. It's like having a heavily armored bank vault with a malfunctioning digital timer lock. You don't abandon the concept of the vault itself, right? You simply use the manual mechanical override.
But
Let me finish. Coldcard has heavily championed the dice roll feature on the Coldcard for years. They built a dedicated feature to cryptographically mix user dice rolls with the hardware TRNG output.
they made it optional.
Optional, yes, but highly encouraged by every major self-custody educator. Users who inputted 50 dice rolls had their seeds completely randomized, rendering that 40-bit down counter fallback mathematically irrelevant. The physical hardware remains incredibly secure against physical extraction. The lesson here isn't that hardware is bad. It's simply that users must take entropy generation into their own hands, which Coldcard fully supports.
But the device did not force them to use dice. That is the critical failure here. It presented users with 24 words on a nice little OLED screen and essentially said, Here is your highly secure cryptographic secret, when in reality, it was handing them a ticking time bomb. It offered a false sense of security.
It was a bug, yes.
A catastrophic bug. Furthermore, a SeedSigner's codebase is so minimal and transparent that this kind of silent fallback logic is much harder to hide. It is fully open source. Coldcard's firmware is only source available under a Commons clause, which restricts commercial use and creates unnecessary friction in the open source peer review process.
I think you're conflating commercial licensing with auditability there. I mean, the source code for Coldcard's firmware is entirely visible to the public. Security researchers can and do read it. The fact that you cannot legally fork their code to sell a competing hardware device doesn't prevent a developer from spotting an RNG fallback flaw. The flaw existed because hardware abstraction layers in embedded systems are inherently complex, not because of a licensing choice.
But complexity is exactly the enemy of security.
Sometimes, yes.
Always. The more complex the system, the more places bugs can hide, which is exactly why we need to look at how these devices actually handle the keys once they are generated.
Okay, I agree. Let's shift from how keys are generated to the architectural boundaries of how they are stored and utilized during a transaction. Coldcard encapsulates its secrets inside those two secure elements. It physically segregates the data.
Sure, but let's break down what that segregation actually looks like in practice. Because there was a massive, widespread misconception in the community about how Coldcard operates under the hood. People think the secure element is this impenetrable cryptographic bunker where the actual transaction signing happens. It isn't.
Well, it stores the encrypted secrets.
Right, it stores them. The microchip and Maxim secure elements on the Coldcard only store encrypted secrets and PIN hashes. But when you actually want to authorize a Bitcoin transaction, the SEC P256K1 ECDSA cryptographic signing, the complex math that proves you own the Bitcoin without revealing your master key, that process takes place on the general-purpose STM320 microcontroller.
The main processor, we should define that for the audience. The STM32 is just a standard everyday computer chip. It's not the heavily armored vault.
Exactly. So the key has to leave the secure element, get decrypted, and sit in the volatile RAM of the STM320 to mathematically sign the transaction. This means an attacker who has physical possession of your Coldcard can use fault injection techniques against the STM320.
Let's explain fault injection for a moment.
Good idea. A fault injection, like laser glitching or voltage glitching, is essentially tripping someone right as they are carrying a highly sensitive document across a room.
That's a good analogy.
By starving the STM32 chip of voltage for a fraction of a millisecond, at the exact moment it processes the decrypted key, an attacker can cause the chip to skip the security instruction that tells it to hide the data. They can potentially extract the private keys in plain text straight out of the RAM or manipulate the signature nonces, completely bypassing the physical protections of those expensive secure elements.
That is an accurate description of the decoupling risk, but I would frame the real-world threat differently. Yes, the MCU decoupling is a known architectural boundary. It is reminiscent of the historical voltage glitching vulnerabilities we saw in early legacy Trezor models.
Very reminiscent.
In those early devices, sure, keys were just sitting in standard unencrypted flash memory, and an attacker with an inexpensive glitching tool could dump the raw seed phrases in under 5 minutes. But Coldcard is significantly hardened against this.
Hardened, but not immune.
True. But the multi-chip architecture requires an attacker to successfully glitch the communication between the components inside a highly secure, epoxy-filled, physically tamper-resistant enclosure. I mean, they have to literally dissolve the epoxy with harsh chemicals without destroying the microscopic traces underneath. It requires a state-level laboratory.
It's difficult, but not impossible.
Now contrast that physical defense with SeedSigner.
I'm listening.
SeedSigner has absolutely no secure element whatsoever. None. It runs on a generic Raspberry Pi Zero board. If an attacker gains physical access to a SeedSigner while it is powered on and loaded with a seed, it is fundamentally defenseless.
While it is powered on, that's the key phrase.
Yes, and that is a critical window. They can literally tap the exposed metal test pads on the Raspberry Pi board, or they can perform a cold boot attack.
which requires being there in person.
Right, but for those unfamiliar, when you freeze RAM with compressed air, the memory doesn't just instantly wipe when the power cuts out. The cold literally traps the electrons in place for a few minutes. An attacker can freeze the running Pi, cut the power, extract the RAM chip, and read your private keys in plain text with relatively basic tools. SeedSigner only possesses maximum security when it is powered off. The moment you plug it into a power source to sign a transaction, it becomes the most physically vulnerable piece of hardware in the room.
But that is precisely the point of a stateless architecture. It is meant to be ephemeral. You only power it on in a highly secure private location. You load the key, you utilize an optical air gap, meaning you scan animated QR codes with the camera to pass the unsigned transaction data in and the signed transaction out. And then you immediately pull the power plug. The window of vulnerability is minutes long and occurs only when you are physically holding the device behind the locked doors of your own home. Who is rushing into your home office with compressed air and a logic analyzer in that 2-minute window?
Well, it requires immense operational discipline on the part of the user.
It does. But by relying purely on animated QR codes through a camera lens, SeedSigner completely avoids the massive attack surface of microSD card file parsers.
To be fair, Coldcard supports air gapping via microSD, QR codes, and NFC on the newer models.
Yes, but handling microSD files introduces complex file parser code into the firmware, which historically is a prime target for buffer overflow attacks. If the code reading the file has a bug, a maliciously crafted transaction file could theoretically exploit the device. SeedSigner uses a minimal Linux kernel specifically to reduce that parsing attack surface. If someone breaks into your house and steals a powered-off SeedSigner, they get a $35 piece of generic silicon with absolutely zero data on it. Storing secrets persistently in flash memory is the original architectural sin of hardware wallets.
But by demanding true statelessness, you are shifting the burden of secure storage entirely to the user.
As it should be.
But you are forcing them to rely on stamped steel plates or pieces of paper hidden in a drawer. If a physical burglar discovers that steel backup, the game is over instantly. They don't need a lab, they just read the words. A Coldcard sitting in that same drawer provides an active, pin-protected, brute force-resistant barrier against someone finding it. It buys you time to realize your house was broken into and time to move your funds before the thief can crack the device.
But all this talk about glitching microscopic chips and freezing RAM ignores a much simpler physical attack vector. What if the thief doesn't need to break into random houses because they know exactly where you live?
Ah, you're talking about corporate data leaks.
I am. I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that commercial hardware vendors can protect their supply chains or their customers' privacy. Let me tell you why. Coldcard is a centralized corporation. When you buy a Coldcard, you give them or their e-commerce partners your name, your physical home address, and your email.
Which is true of almost any purchase.
But we have seen this industry fail repeatedly at protecting that data. Look at the catastrophic Ledger Shopify breach in 2020. The names, phone numbers, and physical addresses of over 270,000 hardware wallet customers were leaked to the dark web.
That was a dark day for the industry, absolutely.
And the consequences were terrifying. Those users suffered targeted physical home intimidation, SIM swapping, and custom hardware phishing devices mailed directly to their homes. Coldcard users have reported similar phishing letters disguised as official Coldcard security updates, urging them to plug in devices and type seed words into malicious websites.
Look, customer data retention is a systemic issue across all e-commerce. I certainly won't deny that risk.
It is a risk that doesn't need to exist. And we have to look at corporate behavior as an extension of this risk. The executive leadership at Coldcard has faced severe community backlash for aggressively purchasing and domain squatting web domains related to SeedSigner.
Yes, that was controversial.
That kind of hostile behavior toward a decentralized open-source community project highlights the exact centralized, profit-driven risk model we are trying to escape by using Bitcoin in the first place. SeedSigner fixes this data trail at the root.
By using generic parts.
Exactly. You buy a generic Raspberry Pi Zero, a generic LCD screen, and a generic micro camera from Amazon or Micro Center. There is no centralized customer database tying you to a Bitcoin hardware company. An observer tracking shipments just sees a hobbyist buying multi-use electronics. There is zero shipping record indicating you possess cryptocurrency.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. While generic parts hide your intent from database hackers, they completely sacrifice physical supply chain integrity.
How so?
When you buy a generic Raspberry Pi off the shelf, you have absolutely no tamper-evident packaging. You have no guarantee of what happened to that circuit board between the factory in Asia and your desk. An advanced adversary could theoretically intercept that generic Pi order and install a physical hardware implant, a microscopic malicious chip bridging the CPU and the RAM that looks completely stock to the naked eye. It's known as an evil mate attack.
But the logistics required to intercept a random electronics package to target a specific individual who might be building a SeedSigner out of the millions of generic boards sold globally to robotics students, it's astronomically improbable compared to targeting a package clearly labeled as originating from a Bitcoin hardware vendor.
Perhaps the physical interception is improbable, but the software supply chain for SeedSigner is arguably just as treacherous for the average user. SeedSigner requires the user to download an OS image and flash it to a microSD card to boot the device.
Right, that's standard for a Pi.
If a user downloads an unverified OS image from a spoofed website or fails to properly verify the PGP release signatures of the authentic file, they could easily boot a compromised operating system into the Pi's RAM. And we should explain that verifying PGP signatures involves using cryptographic keys to mathematically prove the file hasn't been altered by a hacker.
Which is fully documented.
It is, but it is notoriously difficult for non-technical users to do correctly. If they mess that up, that malicious OS could generate mathematically deterministic seeds that the attacker already controls, or display fake receive addresses on the LCD screen, and the user would never know until their funds were gone.
Which is exactly why verifying PGP signatures is so heavily emphasized in the SeedSigner community documentation.
But listen to what we are asking the user to do here. We are expecting the average person to flawlessly execute cryptographic signature verification, manually manage volatile memory security, physically construct a device from bare circuit boards, and never make a mistake writing down their seed phrase because the device will not remember it for them. Coldcard, despite its firmware flaws, arrives in a secure, tamper-evident bag with epoxy-sealed chips and cryptographically verifiable firmware already loaded onto the silicon. It abstracts away a massive amount of operational friction that normally leads to user error.
Operational friction is the price of verifiable security. Prioritizing convenience is exactly what leads to 40-bit RNG fallbacks that cost users $70 million.
Well, as we bring this discussion to a close, I think it's crucial to summarize where these differing philosophies leave the self-custody user today. Despite the painful, multi-million-dollar lessons of this week's RNG flaw, I maintain that dedicated hardware wallets, like Coldcard, still offer the most robust physical protection against theft for the average user.
If managed perfectly.
Yes. If a thief breaks into your home and steals your safe, a hardware vault actively resists physical key extraction. However, this relies entirely on the user strictly utilizing manual dice roll entropy to negate any software bugs and maintaining impeccable operational security regarding how they order the device to protect their physical shipping data.
And I submit that SeedSigner's true statelessness and transparent open source nature offer a zero-trust alternative that is fundamentally superior. It completely removes corporate incompetence, proprietary closed ecosystem code bugs, and persistent flash memory from your threat model entirely.
If the secret isn't stored on the silicon cannot betray you to an attacker. But there is one critical area where our perspectives completely converge today, and it serves as vital, actionable advice for anyone affected by the July 2026 Coldcard disclosure.
Absolutely. If you are migrating away from a Coldcard that was affected by this down-counter RNG flaw, meaning you did not use 50 manual dice rolls. When you initially set up the wallet, you must not simply import your old 12 or 24-word seed phrase into a SeedSigner or any other new hardware device.
Yes, this is paramount.
Do not reuse the seed.
Right. A vulnerable seed is already compromised by the 40 to 72-bit entropy reduction. The underlying mathematics of that specific key are already fundamentally broken. Even if you migrate that broken seed to a perfectly secure, stateless hardware setup, automated sweep bots can still easily guess it and steal your funds. You must generate a completely fresh seed using manual dice rolls, whether on newly patched firmware or a stateless device, and move your funds to the new addresses immediately.
And just to add necessary nuance to that, while strong by 39 passphrases, essentially custom passwords added to your seed, do add manual entropy and drastically lower your immediate risk compared to a standard seed. Relying on an inherently flawed base key is terrible security practice. Security researchers universally agree, generate a fresh seed. Furthermore, if you do transition to a SeedSigner, remember that it has no internal storage. Ensure your physical backup is 100% accurate before pulling the power, because once that pie turns off, the seed is gone from memory forever.
Understanding these multiple threat models, the commercial fortress versus the stateless ghost, is essential for anyone taking self-custody seriously. We strongly encourage listeners to deeply explore the source material and the technical disclosures to decide which trade-offs best fit their personal security profile. Because whether you are placing your trust in the measured thickness of the steel vault walls, or you are finding comfort in the fact that the vault simply ceases to exist the moment you turn off the lights, the ultimate responsibility for verifying the lock is always yours.
Beautifully said.
Thanks for joining us on The Debate.